Imagine for a second a terrifyingly quiet dining room. Nobody is speaking. And then, out of nowhere, a heavy, leather-bound prayer book is hurled across the room, completely shattering these delicate ceramic figurines into just 1,000 tiny pieces. Well, that sudden, violent rupture of silence is exactly where we're going to begin today. Welcome to this explainer, where we are diving deep into the brilliant post-colonial masterpiece Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. So let's unpack this text by looking through its absolute most powerful lens, the intense clash between two entirely different households, and how those environments literally shape the young minds growing up inside them.
The wafer gives me bad breath, and the priest keeps touching my mouth and nauseates me. Now, when Jaja says this, it's not just some minor complaint. It is a massive, practically unthinkable act of defiance. See, Jaja is a teenage boy who has lived his entire life squarely under the thumb of his rigidly Catholic, deeply oppressive father, Papa Eugene. But on Palm Sunday, he simply refuses to take communion. And by speaking those words, Jaja abruptly shatters the terrifying, suffocating silence of his father's household. I mean, it really is the ultimate rebellion. And Adichie doesn't just tell this story straight through from beginning to end. Instead, she brilliantly builds this immense psychological tension by organizing the whole nonlinear narrative around this one central, explosive holiday event. We see the rigid, silent control of before Palm Sunday, then we get the shocking confrontation on the day itself, and finally, the inevitable collapse after Palm Sunday. This framing is so smart because it emphasizes that Jaja's defiance isn't just, a teenage tantrum. It's a structural earthquake for the entire family. This nonlinear plot structure continuously pulls us back to that single moment, forcing us to understand how this family's transformation was completely inevitable.
Part 1. The Palm Sunday Rebellion. To truly understand the weight of Jaja's defiance, we actually have to look at his namesake. Jaja is named after King Jaja of Obobo. He was a real historical 19th century king who very famously refused to bow down to British imperial control over trade. He absolutely wouldn't sell his soul. So the crucial point here is that in the novel, Jaja's teenage rebellion isn't just about skipping church. It is a profound, highly symbolic stand against oppressive imperial control, except this time, it's manifesting right inside his own living room.
Part 2. Eugene's rigid colonial rule.
So the root of Eugene's extreme behavior actually stems from a concept called epistemic violence. Now, this is a heavy term, but basically it refers to the destruction of indigenous languages and cultures by colonizers. And Eugene is an interesting case. He's wealthy, he's incredibly generous to the church, he even publishes a newspaper that actively fights government corruption, yet he equates the English language with civilization and outright hates his native Igbo tongue. He rules his family with these brutal physical schedules, entirely alienated from his own cultural identity. It perfectly reflects the deep, lasting impact of post-colonial values on family life, showing us a father who genuinely believes he's saving his children's souls by crushing their spirits.
Which brings us to a really tragic realization. Eugene has basically swallowed what the author Ngugi wa Thiong'o calls the cultural bomb. It's completely annihilated his belief in his own heritage, and this internalized hatred, it leads him to reject his own traditionalist father, Papa Nunkwo. He actually refuses to let him in the house just because he practices indigenous Igbo religion. Eugene uses his wealth to forcibly convert others, tragically marching, as the book puts it, like a fly blindly following a corpse, straight into the grave of colonial ideology.
Part 3. Ifeoma's Garden of Freedom. Now let's put these two worlds side by side, because the contrast is wild. Over in Enugu, at Eugene's house, you have terrifying silence, physical abuse, and a rigid religious fanaticism that entirely rejects the past. But then you cross over to Nsukka, to Aunty Ifeoma's house, and it is filled with laughter, open debate, and this really beautiful indigenized Catholic faith where traditional Igbo songs mix so naturally with prayers. And most importantly, Ifeoma loves and cares for their traditionalist father, Papa Nunkwo. Ifeoma's home essentially represents the decolonized mind. It's a place of cultural pride and healing that stands in direct opposition to her brother's dogmatic control.
So when Eugene's deeply traumatized daughter, Kambili, who also happens to be our narrator, when she visits Nsukka, she has this incredibly powerful realization. She discovers what she calls a freedom to be, to do. Getting away from her father's heavy fists and impossible expectations, Kambili realizes that her aunt's home offers a totally different, intoxicating kind of freedom. It's this nurturing environment that essentially acts as a greenhouse for the children's suppressed identities, finally allowing them to just breathe.
Part 4. Defying traditional gender roles.
You know, Ifeoma's feminist agency is just a constant force in the story. First off, she completely refuses to measure her worth by how many children she can have. And when her wealthy brother Eugene tries to control her with these highly conditional, manipulative financial gifts, she flat out rejects them. And remember, she's struggling under a corrupt, unpaid military regime, so that takes guts. She ignores all the community pressure to remarry, deciding to prioritize her university career instead. And as a parent, she definitely doesn't demand terrified silence. She acts more like a coach, actively encouraging her kids to speak their minds. She absolutely proves you don't need to be wealthy or married to be a powerful, independent force.
Part 5. The children finally transform.
The escalation of the children's growth here is just fascinating to watch. Let's break it down. Step 1. Kambili finds her literal and emotional voice through her interactions with a culturally proud priest, Father Amadi. Step 2, she physically defends a painting of her grandfather, taking a brutal beating from her father rather than surrendering her heritage. Step 3, we circle right back to Jaja rejecting the Eucharist on Palm Sunday. And finally, step 4, their mother, Mama Beatrice, realizes she has to stop the cycle of domestic terror, which leads to her desperate, fatal act of poisoning Eugene. It's the exposure to Ifeoma's nurturing parenting style that gives Eugene's family the mental clarity they need to, quite literally, topple their dictator.
Part 6. The Purple Hibiscus Blues.
Visually, there is such a stark contrast between these two worlds, specifically tied to the title. Back in Enugu, Eugene's estate is totally dominated by the red hibiscus. Now that represents rapid blooming, sure, but also pain, blood, and his aggressive, unyielding dominance. But over in Nsukka, Aunty Ifeoma is growing an experimental purple hibiscus. It's rare, it's fragrant, and as Kambili notes, it carries these undeniable undertones of freedom. So when Jaja brings those purple stalks back to plant in his father's garden, he is quite literally planting the seeds of rebellion and free thought straight into the soil of his oppression. And that brings us to a pretty heavy question I want to leave you with. Does true freedom always require the destruction of the past? Because ultimately, the liberation of the Enugu household comes at a massive, massive cost. Eugene is poisoned to death by his wife, and Jaja falsely takes the blame, ending up in a brutal prison just to protect his mother. The purple hibiscus blooms, yes, but the soil it grows in is soaked in tragedy. It really forces us to ask what price we are actually willing to pay to break the silence and truly be free. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.